Welcome, everybody, panelists and guests. Thanks for joining us on today's webinar. 2023, the year in review. We're going to be spending the bulk of today going back, looking at 2023, the year of interoperability and harmonization in climate and ESG, and really using that as a jump off point to help companies prepare for what they should be doing looking ahead to 2024. This was a busy year this past year for climate regulations. We saw a lot of consolidation and frameworks and an organization that managed those frameworks. And it was a really clarifying year for scope 3 as well. We had major consortiums and enterprises across industries announcing ambitious net zero goals with a distinct and very targeted focus on scope 3 supply chain decarbonization. So as we look back over the year, we're here today to really anchor and distill all of those impactful developments over the past year and discuss how companies can best prepare and for the expectations of what's to come in 2024. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce who we have, all of our guests today. So I'm Melissa Raid. I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer of Sustain Life. And we're joined today by esteemed panelists and real experts in the ESG field. So we have Matthew Gardner, founder and managing partner of SustainServe, a Boston and Zurich-based firm that works with public and private sector organizations to design and implement sustainability strategies, programs, and communications. The network includes a variety of strategy and data and communications. And then in Matt's free time, he also teaches an entrepreneurship course in sustainability and environmental management at Harvard. So thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa.
Sure. We're also joined by Madhuri Pavamani, the Director of Sustainability and ESG Advisory Practice and the Practice Manager of the Civil Rights and Racial Equity Audit Practice at Paul Weiss. In that work, she advises leading companies in the private equity, transportation, technology, and insurance industries on the public disclosures, corporate governance practices, and diversity and inclusion initiatives. So certainly a valuable voice to have in the room. And thanks so much for joining us, Madhuri.
Thanks, Alyssa.
And then, of course, we have Sustain Life's very own Mitch Voss, Senior Director of Sustainability and the Technical Climate Lead at Sustain Life. Mitch spent most of his time conceptualizing all of the amazing carbon management software tools and features that you see in our platform. Prior to joining us at Sustain, Mitch also worked for KPMG, where he led sustainability and advisory engagements. He also sits on the ISO TC 207 subcommittee, which is responsible for the ISO 14064 standard, which for any real accounting nerds in the room is the greenhouse gas emissions accounting standard. So I'm absolutely honored and thrilled to welcome you all and am really looking forward to today's conversation. Awesome. So we'll do a super quick high level for those who are unfamiliar with Sustain Life. We do thank you for joining us today. We're a decarbonization SaaS platform focused specifically on supply chain engagement and decarbonization of scope 3 emissions. We have a suite of carbon calculators and auxiliary tools that enable businesses to measure emissions across scopes 1, 2, and 3, set science-based targets, engage with suppliers, harmonize disclosures across the alphabet soup of ESG, and drive really meaningful progress through the value chain. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We have a pretty full agenda to get through. So without further ado, let's really dive in. We all kind of wanted to anchor this discussion in where we are in 2023 and the kind of state of the union, state of affairs of the world. And where we are is that 2023, we've experienced the hottest year ever on record. It was a very hot year and it was a very expensive year. In the US alone, we had 25 distinct extreme weather events, each with $1 billion of damage. So $25 billion in the US alone in 2023. And we see the estimated cost of climate damage by 2050 across the globe estimated anywhere between 1.7 and $3.1 trillion. So whenever we talk about climate, this is something we always like to really anchor on at Sustain Life. Climate is obviously, it has intrinsic value, but it also has very critical economic and financial value to the stability of our planetary and societal systems. And so we're seeing a lot of impact to those. We have 99% of the global population exposed to unhealthy air quality. That's, to me, a very crazy and alarming metric. And almost 2 billion people without access to clean and safe drinking water, in addition to millions of dollars in supply chain disruptions. And so as we get into this conversation, especially all of us speaking about this on this panel, and I'm sure for all of you on the line that are doing this work for your corporations, we often get so wrapped up in the world of ESG reporting and regulations and metrics and disclosures. But I think it's really important for us not to forget the backdrop of where we're coming from and why these corporate regulations are in place in the first place, where we see the physical and economic undertow of climate change. And this is really all about long term resilience and value creation. It's about how we mitigate these very real risks and then identify and take advantage of these really real and meaningful opportunities and turn them into strategic business decisions. And that is what ESG is all about. So, how did we react to this kind of state of affairs in 2023? We had a surge in climate related regulation. We're going to get into it, the whole alphabet soup, but thinking in the EU, CSRD, CBAM, California here in the US, their climate package with SB 253 and 261, our beloved but languishing SEC proposal for standardized climate disclosure. We also saw so many evolving sustainability and reporting frameworks. So we had GRI and EFRAG announcing interoperability of CSRD reporting. We have the big kahuna of interoperability, ISSB incorporating SASB and TCFD. But then apart from kind of that also mandated disclosure, we see pressure for enterprise-driven programs. It's not just the mandated companies. We're seeing huge upticks in that scope 3 decarbonization work and supply chains. And so with my somewhat, I hope not meandering, but long preamble here, this really is what we want to anchor for everybody in how we're seeing these really critical themes kind of coalesce and really anchor in how companies can be thinking really strategically about ESG and climate, because this is not just a disclosure exercise. It's part of it, but this is a very real part of a business strategy to create value and long-term resilience. So these are the pillars that we wanted to talk about today. These are the themes that we're all seeing. And I promise that I'm going to do as little talking as possible on the rest of this webinar and invite our guests to answer a couple of questions here. So I think before I kick it off, actually, if there's any somewhat opening remarks that anybody else wants to add, please don't allow me to steal all the show. And if not, we can just dive right into our first pillar here for everyone. Great. Okay, so materiality, this huge buzzword in the world of sustainability, I think definitely in 2023. It's certainly been around for a long time, but I think more and more companies are understanding the nuances and distinctions of what is single materiality, what is impact versus financial, and double materiality. So, Mitch, I thought maybe you could start us off. Can you provide a high level overview of the concept of materiality from the ESG lens, how that relates to risks and opportunities, and walk us through that impact financial and double materiality ecosystem?
Sure thing. So yeah, materiality is essentially the relevance or importance of certain topics or issues to an organization. And the whole process of doing, for example, a materiality assessment is determining what your internal and external stakeholders really care about and how that's going to affect and ultimately impact things like your strategy and your overall program. And the difference are kind of three options that we have there is first impact materiality, which is essentially the impact of the company on ESG issues. So kind of that called outside or inside out view. We also have financial, which is the impact of ESG issues on the company. I'll call that like the inside or outside in, view of materiality. And there's a new and emerging, well, not so much emerging anymore, but double materiality is basically the mix of those two, where you're looking at and kind of taking the view from internal and external stakeholders on what is important, what should the company be caring about, as well as what is the impact that your organization has on ESG issues and topics. It's a process that you'll go through and continually be updating as things move and things change. And the real goal of that process is to focus on value creation. You're really trying to figure out what should your organization really be looking at and caring about as you build out your program and strategy.
Awesome. Thank you. So, yeah. So double materiality certainly didn't just come on the scene, but now that it is a required part of any company covered by CSRD, which, as we know, is 50,000 companies worldwide, over 5,000 of which are in the US, it's certainly something that is taking a much more standardized and anchored foothold in that initial ESG strategy component of how companies build out these programs. And so as companies are starting to do this, Matt, I think a question that I'd love for you to share with the audience is, how are you seeing corporate clients really respond to this requirement? What does this really look like in practice across the exposure of your clientele, knowing, that you've got a European foothold, you've got a US foothold, and that gamut of how companies approach it?
Yeah, I mean, it's really upping the ante in terms of how companies need to be engaging with the topic. I mean, as Mitch said, until now, the concept of materiality was kind of a box ticking exercise that companies would do if they're doing their first a GRI report or something. They would go through a process to ask some questions, maybe do a little survey work, maybe do some interviews or roundtables within the organization to benchmarking to understand, what topics should they be reporting on. And, as time went on, companies kind of realized that there was an opportunity to think about materiality a little more strategically. And the way we think about it is that, by asking the right questions, you can really understand, where does your organization have big impacts? What are the topics that impact your company? Really it's the foundations, it's the foundational elements of a good ESG strategy, certainly, if not a corporate strategy. And so spending some time on this to really figure out of the hundreds of topics that fall under the umbrella of environmental, social governance, what are the 10 that really matter to you? Where should you be focusing your limited time, limited resources, limited bandwidth so that you can really, manage those things effectively? If they're important, if these topics are important according to a materiality process, then you should be managing them. And we can talk about that more a little bit later. But now comes CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the underlying regulations that CSRD is based upon, where they, lay out some fairly clear prescriptions in terms of what they want to see companies to be looking at in order to determine what they then should be disclosing publicly to stakeholders, to the markets, so that people can make informed decisions and have an informed understanding of what's going on with those companies. And so, here in the US, for example, a lot of our clients, US based publicly traded companies, they meet the threshold that CSRD outlines about, when they would be subject to these laws. And so they're needing to go through this double materiality process. And we're, in the process of doing that first cohort of those now. The challenges for companies is that, this is the first time through, laws, as most laws are, there's room for interpretation. There's little fuzzy gray areas. And so, companies are in some cases struggling or overshooting how far they need to go. But, you got to do it, or you need to start preparing for it, because that first cohort of companies that are going to be subject to CSRD and are going to have to report against it, or, it's going to be coming online in a couple of years. And so as a result, these first rounds of double materiality processes according to CSRD are happening. And it's a lot more in our experience, it's somewhat more involved than a traditional kind of light touch GRI-ish materiality process. It's something where you really need to sit down and, as Mitch said, think through risks and opportunities and the timelines for the impacts and a variety of other criteria where that information needs to be folded into the overall materiality process. Ultimately, this whole thing needs to be audited or assured externally by auditors. But, the auditors and the folks who are doing that work are on, in the process of either assuring the first processes, or they're even still developing the standards in some places as to, the audit standards. And so, it's a little bit of an exploration for a lot of companies. There's a little bit of uncertainty as to what ultimately is going to be the kind of the gold standard of it.
Yeah.
But the key is to get going now, and start asking those questions, get the people involved. In our experience, materiality processes are a great way to engage across the organization and to, give people insight as to why you're focusing on what you're focusing on as part of your ESG program. So get on it now, start thinking about it, start putting the pieces in place so that you can be ready when your organization is subject to these disclosure laws.
I couldn't agree more. And I feel like so often in ESG, in this world of sustainability, like any industry, but we like to use a lot of jargon and a lot of terminology and a lot of fancy phrasing. And whenever materiality comes up, I always just, when talking about it, it's like, what is this formal process? Talk to your stakeholders, talk to the organizations, affiliations, people, stakeholders that are important to your business, right? And understand what are the most important issues to them from your business. And that to me is just smart business strategy. And I think we're going to keep coming up on this theme because I think really what ESG has evolved into, despite its politicalization in the US, is really about de-risking, identifying risks and opportunities, engaging with those stakeholders, and understanding what is it that's important for them to know about your business, which just sounds like a better business practice. This phrase also is adopted from financial accounting. And so, Madhuri, I'm curious as someone, with a lot of exposure, with mandated financial filings, how do ESG topics kind of perform against the quantifiable measure of financial materiality in that lens in financial filings? And if you see that changing over time.
Yeah, I think in terms of coming from from the legal perspective, the lawyers in the room, we always get a little nervous when we hear materiality. And so what I've seen is it's changing. We're going to start, I think, as the regulations come on board, we're going to see a bit of an expansion in, let's say, SEC filings. I think right now, securities attorneys, I'm not a securities attorney, but I work with some, and I do think, they've been really, just taking a very conservative, until there's more regulations, the approach has been very conservative as to, what filings look like and what is actually going into the filings. I think as we see the regulatory landscape really heat up globally and in the US, I think definitions from a legal perspective of materiality will likely expand. And we're probably what if we look back at a securities filing in 2020 versus a securities filing in 2025, I think we're going to see more ESG factors present in those filings based upon what we're seeing, what Matt and Mitch and you talked about in the regulatory space. I think it's really going to push what you start to see from the legal perspective.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, so much of materiality really lays this groundwork for ESG strategy and governance. It's really the jump off point of how you then go and develop and implement those programs. And so, Madhuri, a question for you is how is the role of corporate governance evolving in the context of increasing ESG scrutiny?
I think just from my experience, what I'm seeing is the clients who in 2020 when we launched our ESG practice and would come to us really wondering, where does ESG sit? What do I even do with ESG? We've already got this governance structure going on. Where do I weave ESG in? Do I even need to? Versus now, and I'm sure Matt, you probably have a ton of clients like this as well. Now our clients are coming to us pretty much more sophisticated. They've thought about ESG. They might have chief sustainability officers. The board is handling ESG. I think we're starting to see it. It's much more robust. And what makes me feel good is that there's a process in place, and they're coming to our team to really, to have us take a look at what they've built and how can they make it better? Where are the gaps? How do they benchmark against their peers? And what can they do to strengthen the governance for, within the organization? So when they're reporting out, they're mitigating really any sort of risk and improving their bottom line.
Yeah. I frankly have seen the same thing in terms of in the beginning, the new word comes out materiality and what should we do? What do we do? And so you're going to your trusted advisors and your solution providers and your support network. And it's okay, where's the rule book? Tell us how it is we should be doing this. And I think throughout, a lot through really all of sustainability, we're seeing so much maturation occur across companies, across all different industries, where they understand, like, okay, now we actually get some criticism because you realize these things actually aren't so prescriptive. That, and I talk about this often, that things are as much of an art as they are a science. And I think that that can be challenging for companies that really just want to know, tell me what to do so I can do it and know that I'm doing it by the book and correctly. But the truth is, the real value in having these initiatives and program provide value to the business and to the economy and to all the stakeholders is to really take ownership of them and evolve them over time as to what's unique and pertinent and relevant to your business. And that's not something you can write in a rule book. That's not something you can write in a framework. This is all about giving companies the guidelines of how to think through this. But then the work is you got to think through it and what makes sense for
Yeah.
your business.
It's also what looks good today might not look good 6 months from now. And you need to also be very dynamic in your strategy and open to agile, and willing to kind of, see around the corners and make some changes because I mean, we see this every day. I mean, the it changes every day. This space is just sometimes feels explosive.
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah.
and that just speaks to the importance of revisiting both materiality, but also, your approaches, your management systems and processes on a regular basis, because exactly as you say, Madhuri, it's dynamic. I mean, a materiality process, just to harp on that, is a snapshot in time. It's what's important today. And what's really interesting to do when you're thinking about material issues is to think about the time evolution or the possible time evolution. What might be important in 5 years' time that you might want to start putting the pieces in place now so that you're prepared for it. It's interesting in our work. I mean, yeah, a lot of companies are thinking about this stuff. They've got their first ESG report out there, and they've got goals, they got targets. A surprising number of publicly traded companies are just now starting to, maybe pull their heads out of the sand, or they're just, they're convinced that it's important now. They've got enough inquiries from customers or from investors where they're just starting out, and they're just starting to build programs. It's interesting. It's interesting to have those conversations, and what we need to do, what folks, the sustainability professionals who are internal to companies need to be doing is to really think about, not just kind of the recipe for materiality, but think about the organization. How mature is it? How ready is it to be putting those pieces in place? It really needs to be kind of bespoke for each company based upon the culture, the history. I've got clients who are completely sales driven, top line. That's all that matters. Great. There's ways to address it in those cases. There are others where, the CEO has decided that, that he or she is just going to, this is their legacy. This is how they want to run their business. Great. With that data point, we can then, you can then design a really robust, effective, enduring sustainability program within the company. But to keep your eyes open to those nuances of the company is maybe is one of the more important factors in my experience to designing a truly sustainable sustainability program within a company.
Yeah. I mean, and from our perspective at Sustain, companies are usually coming to us because they've identified climate and emissions. That is material to our stakeholders. That's material to our business. We need help automating that process, integrating that into our core business model, connecting to existing systems of record, really making this part of our existing business function, not a siloed separate exercise. And so I think we've also seen this shift on the KPIs and metrics to those that are really science based. And so, of course, in the climate and emissions world, we're thinking science based targets. And, that can sound very intimidating. It's certainly not easy to set, let alone achieve a science based target. It is ambitious. But Mitch, given that this is so much of our focus, how can companies, especially those that are SMEs and maybe don't have, the deep bench of expertise and additional support, systems, how can they actually get started on implementing and executing these more rigorous, science-based targets and strategy?
Yeah, sure thing. And I think going back to your point, I think ambition is really one of the key things to focus on and think about at first. Like, how ambitious do we really want to be? Do we want to be leaders in the space? Do we want to be, moving the needle for things like net zero or science-based targets? Um, or, knowing our company culture, our resourcing, our capacity, can we even start with something more simple or more streamlined? And I would say, on that topic of ambition, like setting a science-based target, I think a lot of organizations think that a lot of the people that we talk to at first are a little afraid or scared to start the process. And my advice would be just to start evaluating what your different glide path and options are to start reducing emissions, and then evaluate that against, the science-based target framework. Start looking at, how ambitious do we need to be in order to achieve or be able to set a target. And a lot of times, I think you'll find that there are plenty of opportunities out there for you to start reducing emissions. So identifying those hotspots and pulling on those emission reduction levers that a lot of organizations can really reasonably achieve a science-based target. And, going through that process just provides that extra vote of confidence that, hey, this is something we can and really should be doing.
Right. Yeah. And we actually haven't spoken too much about governance, the G word, but governance is such a critical part of all of this, right? In terms of how a company is holding itself accountable to its stakeholders and how it manages these things. And I think that's something that we've definitely seen. I think it's another one of those kind of topics where like governance, it's not, I'll say this a little simplified, but like it's not just for the big boys, right? Like governance really just means intentional and attentive management practices, right? How are you governing these issues? Who's responsible for them? Who's monitoring them? Who's reviewing them? What are the corrective action practices in place? And again, I'm probably going to be saying this a lot throughout this webinar. Those are good business practices. Like ESG is not this other thing outside of good, resilient, strategic business practice.
But very simply, Alyssa, I mean, if you've gone through a structured process of deciding what's important to your business, what's important to your stakeholders, where are your impacts significant, what issues impact you significantly, where are there financial risks and opportunities. If you've gone through a process to identify a portfolio of issues that are relevant and, according to the criteria that you've defined, kind of makes sense that they should therefore be managed. Someone should be in charge, someone should be accountable to it. You should have a process for monitoring progress, what moves the needle or which direction is the needle going? How do you set goals? What happens, like you said, what happens when things go in a direction that you didn't anticipate? What's your corrective action process? What are your guiding policies and philosophies around this stuff?
Yep.
It's kind of common sense, if it's important to your business, then manage it.
Yep.
That's the bottom line.
I mean, we have governance on just like a basic project, like just something you've got to get out the door in 2 days. You have some sort of governance around getting that deliverable out the door. So why wouldn't you expand that further for your business? Mitch, it was funny because when you talked about ambition, I immediately, as I was like, oh, I'm such a lawyer, because I was like, I would call that risk appetite. I was like, wow,
Yeah.
we're totally, but I love it.
Two
I
sides of
love
the same coin. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
dude.
That's funny.
Totally. There's actually one bullet on here that I want to dig into a little bit and make a little bit more tangible for folks on the line, because I think it will resonate, with the breadth of companies we have tuning in. Can we talk a little bit about goals and how those can set up to be either top down or bottom up, and how to think through that at your organization and what might influence you, to choose which way to go?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that.
Sure.
It's we see goals all the time where basically the C-suite says, hey, we're going to cut energy emissions by 50%, or we're going to set a science-based target, which will require X percent over 10 years for your greenhouse gases, scope 1 and 2. Go figure it out and report back once you figured it out. So it's this top-down approach that says, here's the number, come back and tell us how you're going to do it, make it happen. In simple words, the bottom-up goal, you can approach it differently, and we've worked with companies to help them go through and say, okay, we want to set a greenhouse gas goal, but we want to be really sure that we can accomplish it. And, most companies, most publicly traded companies, or companies that we work with, there's always that tension. They say, what is our science-based target? But we also want to know that we're going to be able to achieve it. Very few companies are willing just to take a flyer and say, okay, we're going to set it. We don't know how we're going to do it, but we're going to set it. I've got a couple of examples where, in fact, that was the case, which is really interesting. But anyway, so from the bottom up, though, you could go and you could set an energy and thus greenhouse gas goal by going around and, looking at all your facilities around the world and doing energy audits on all of them. And you could understand, how much energy could you save, for how much money, because, it'll cost you to do the upgrades that you need to put lighting in, to put variable speed drives into HVAC equipment or whatever it is. But you can then build that picture and say, all right, if we spend $10 million over the next 5 years, the energy engineers say that we can save 40%, electricity, which you can then translate obviously into greenhouse gases. So you can build that kind of picture, and you can say, all right, from the bottom up, we think we can get to this point. From the top down, here's what it's telling us to do. Usually there's a gap between them. You can't quite get all the way there. And then you can decide if you've got the appetite to say, we're going to change human behavior to make up the rest of it, which is always an interesting conversation to have. So really it's just different ways of kind of triangulating onto a target. Science-based targets, they have a cachet, they've got, you get credibility and brownie points by doing that, at the same time, build, doing an exercise to really assess what's possible and how much it's going to cost, can then give the CFOs, the general counsels, the CEOs eventually, ultimately the comfort that if they set this goal, then they've got a pretty clear path as to how to get there.
Yep. We absolutely see the same thing across our customer base as well. And I just think that's something to share. Those that are the solution providers in this space have the benefit of the broad exposure to all the different ways that companies do it, which isn't, when you're in-house and you're in your own company, you don't have that broader context often. And so I think I just wanted to convey to those tuning in that, again, there's no rule book here. You think about what's going to work best for your company culture and your company approach and style, what you think will have either the best buy-in or the most realistic, chance of success. And you do what works. I do want to shift over because I know that so many folks on the line, for better or worse, reporting is a major and critical part of sustainability, ESG, climate. We sometimes use those terms interchangeably, of course. We all know they mean different things. And so as we talk, we're going to talk a little bit about the regulations on the next slide, but I actually want to anchor this conversation thinking of, yes, mandated disclosure, but also still that ongoing voluntary reporting to the frameworks. The stakes are getting higher there as well. And so I think the first question I want to start with, Madhuri, for you, from a risk standpoint, how do you advise customers or clients, I should say, to disclose in the standalone ESG report versus something like an integrated filing? And does that change? Does it change across those formats?
I think, and this kind of goes back to what you were just talking about. I think mostly in terms of goals, it's be reasonable and make sure you can do what you say you're doing. And then that brings us to the reporting. I think, when I work with my clients, whether it's an ESG report or security filing, it's that you have to be consistent. I'm assuming when it gets to me that you are, you actually can do what you say you're doing. When I see risks, when I see commitments that really sound a little outrageous or just over the skis a bit, we do try to talk to them about pulling them back to sound, to seem more reasonable. But I think the larger analysis is the consistency of your reporting. Just because if you say something in your ESG report, it needs to align with what's on your website, what's on your social media, and what is in your filings. Everything there cannot be inconsistencies. And as this space becomes more scrutinized, this sort of consistency analysis and assessment just is an absolute must. The silos that I mean, I know I even like we tend to, you get into a silo. Those silos really, as this space matures, are going to have to be, kind of done away with. We're going to have a lot more speaking across the different pillars in an organization just to make sure the messaging is consistent throughout.
Yeah, I mean, this to me, it goes back to also we haven't named this by name yet, but we're talking about greenwashing, right? Like any kind of public statement or disclosure or stance, whether it's right, like printed in your ESG report or on your website or whatever the kind of medium forum is, like that's a statement, that's a claim. And I think what we're seeing is this expectation that you better be able to back it up and not just because your stakeholders will care, but there's legal recourse for
Yeah,
it.
the regulators are
Yeah.
watching. They're looking for keywords. If you use certain words in your reporting, you really need to be able to back it up. So there's, people, I hope as this whole process matures that, everyone is kind of getting a good process in place for these consistency checks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know we have a bullet here, but I actually do think it's so important. The combination of data and narrative to provide that context. That's important, right? Of course, everyone wants to know the number and the measure, and you can, have that quantifiable data point. But there's also an important like contextualization of what it represents. What's the narrative? What's the story behind it? Because a number in isolation how much value is that really providing? There's so much more to dig into the nuance of what it represents, what it doesn't. That's so much of where we work with customers in terms of being very clear and transparent about what a number represents and what it does not represent. With like a tactical example being if you're disclosing your emissions and you're talking about scope three, well, what categories of scope three did you include in that measure? Because if you didn't include scope three category one PDS, probably missing out on a very large portion. And so just being very transparent in what you're representing because there are more eyes looking at it and they might all want a little bit of a different thing and everybody's trying to kind of piece out, what they can. And so I guess with that, like so much of this work, it's foundational, it's process oriented, it's strategic, but there's also that other side of being a bit more transactional or mechanical in the reporting. And so, Mitch, from your perspective, how are companies kind of approaching this? What support or solutions are they looking for when it comes to that more mechanical, methodical, audit grade kind of process behind these disclosures, especially on the emission side, just, knowing about assurance?
Yeah, yeah, sure thing. And I think that to go back to your point too, I'll double click on scope three because I think that's where a lot of this comes in play. And the key really is transparency and auditability of that data. And I'd say that's one of the big concerns is that, hey, if we're going to put this number out, if we're going to be saying, here's our emissions across scope one, two, and three, but again, mainly in scope three, we want to be able to say, here's how we calculate the numbers. Here's where we potentially use proxy or estimates for data and be very clear in how that's done. And having the tools and systems in place to be able to do that consistently, reliably, and most importantly, for example, like year over year, if you're doing it for reporting and in a way that you can very clearly showcase and share how the numbers were calculated, as well as where there potentially are, again, proxies used and how the numbers came together so that when someone is looking at those numbers and making decisions based on that, they've got all the information at hand.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess reporting's sister is the regulatory landscape and mandated disclosure and reporting. And so, Matt, I'll kick this one to you first. And you kind of already touched to it in some of your opening comments, but what are the regulations that you see as the real primary drivers of your clients', reporting efforts?
Yeah, I think right now, it's CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in the EU, and there's thresholds that even if you're not an EU flagged company, if you're here in the US, but you're across a certain threshold of revenue and numbers of employees over there, then you may be subject, if you want to do business there, then you got to report it according to their rules. And so that's a hot topic. That's something that's going to be very, very impactful, moving fast. The first cohorts of companies are going to be starting to do these reports in the coming, in the next 18 to 24 months. California, in terms of greenhouse gas disclosures, absolutely. Even if you're, California's got some regulations in place where if you're using carbon credits and you are using that to help achieve net zero or goals, then you need to be disclosing information around that and transparency into those. So that could be pretty influential. See, it'll come out at some point, but it's, honestly, I think SEC is going to be easy in comparison to what CSRD and other things are asking. It's going to be pretty straightforward. Really what we tell our clients is, get good counsel who's familiar on the ground with what you have. I mean, so we work with, Swiss and German lawyers for EU stuff and European based regs and lawyers here in the US just to, are you really eligible, or subject to these these different rules? Pay attention to the timelines. Again, depending on how big you are, where you're operating, how many employees you have, what sectors you're operating in may play a significant role in terms of determining whether or not you're subject to these regs. Pay attention to assurance requirements. Assurance is going to become the name of the game in general across many of these schemes. But, you got to do your homework. As soon as regulations come into play, obviously, and all the lawyers on the call are going to, nod accordingly, I think. As soon as these become legally required things, you really got to pay close attention. It's not just something you do in your spare time any longer. This is an exercise that becomes just like financial reporting and all of the regulations that oversee that. So do your homework and get good counsel so that you're fulfilling all of the obligations that you have under the law.
Yeah.
And to add to the regulatory soup, I think yesterday or early this morning, the EU, I think they agreed that the corporate sustainability due diligence directive as well. So now we're adding this whole, now you have not just the environmental impacts, but you've got the S. We're bringing in the S into this reporting framework. So it just gets more interesting and complicated every day.
One of the
Yeah.
nuances of this is that sometimes these regs are simply disclosure regulations, kind of like what conflict minerals was initially, where it's just says you just got to disclose what
Yeah.
you know and what you are doing rather than being prescriptive. But in the case of, for example, again, back to CSRD, there's a fair bit of prescription there in terms of how you have to go about the process there, in terms of the due diligence, you need to be thinking about and talking about human rights, for example, child labor, forced labor, stuff like that. And so, it's
It's
getting
the
more
steps you're
complicated.
taking to mitigate. Well, right? So that is also different. It's not just this is what we're doing, but we see this issue and we have a strategy in place to decrease our negative impact.
That's right. Absolutely.
Yep. And I do want to take a second just to double click into assurance because it's like the big scary A word, that I think a lot of companies are preparing for. And I think that's a good thing, right? Like we've gotten a lot more sophisticated, a lot more mature. The expectations are higher. So I'll kick this one to Mitch as I believe a former assurer yourself. How should companies be thinking about and preparing for the assurance of this data?
Yeah, I would say biggest thing is being confident and knowing that your calculation methodologies and how everything is being done is transparent. There's nothing that an insurer hates more is basically saying, well, here's the starting number and here's the final number, and asking the question, well, how'd you get there? And someone's not able to say exactly the calculations that were done, or it just goes into a black box and I get my number. Things like inventory management plans, I think, are crucial as part of that too, being able to share and document, hey, here's the steps that we took in order to build out and do these calculations. And having a system of record that is easily auditable is super key with the controls that you have in place.
Yep. I mean, we never like to plug sustain life too much on these. That's really not the point. But I do think, regardless of your technology solution provider, a critical part of it is that trail and that auditability and the transparency in terms of where did the activity data come from? Is it primary data? Is it proxy data? What manipulations, went behind it? What assumptions were made? Is this a pro rata allocation? Those are the details that an auditor, needs to know so that they can understand again, you can have almost the same exercise of doing emissions calculations. And depending on what approach you take, depending on what assumptions you make, what methodology you pursued of the greenhouse gas protocol, you can wind up with very different numbers. And the point of the whole audit and assurance is to be transparent and say, well, this is the path we took. This is what we did. This is what is reasonable for us to, execute, and providing those, breadcrumbs to get them from that point A to that point B. Well, we weren't even talking about emissions a little bit. So let's really dive in to scope 3. There's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety around scope 3 emissions. And so, Mitch, I'll kick this one to you first. How can companies start? And are there different modes that are required across the disclosures that drives companies in what they're facing in either the mandated market or, frankly, that market-driven market? My most important customer is asking me what my emissions are because they now need to report on their scope 3 and they've set this target and they need to decarbonize. How should they be thinking about this and the different approaches and just where to start?
Yeah, it's another area like similar to what we were talking about with SBTs as well. As soon as scope 3 is brought up, a lot of professionals will certainly be scared away from it. I think that's why we have that first point of it is the boogeyman of GHG emissions. It is a mix of an art and a science, and knowing what your business objectives and your end goals are at the start of that process is super key. For example, something that Matt and I were talking about a little while ago that for example, in scope 3 category 1, purchase goods and services, you've got many different ways to do those calculations. You can do it as a spend-based approach where you're just taking, your spend, matching commodities, using it against EIO emission factors and getting your numbers. Well, if you go through that process and you do those calculations and next year say, hey, we want to reduce our emissions in PG&S, really the only way you're going to do that is if those emission factors are updated or you've spent less money, which is not a great strategy in terms of emission reductions, where there are other areas where proxies and using that type of calculation is totally fine. Sometimes in category 15, for example, in your investments, if it's a small part of your overall emission profile, sometimes like less than 1%, using that proxy data could be acceptable. And knowing those outcomes and knowing what your business objectives are at the beginning of that process are super critical. So again, in that PG&S example, if you know that it is going to be a major part of your strategy and what you're looking to accomplish, go and start looking at, for example, primary data, where there are plenty of tools out there. Again, like Alyssa said, don't like to plug our tool all the time, every time, but there are tools within the Sustain Life platform that allow you to access primary data from our Sustain Life database right off the bat, where with those same 3 pieces of data, how much you spent, who you spent it with, and what you purchased, you can actually pull the emissions and create actionable insights within your supply chain. So looking at who are the suppliers we want to engage with, how do we want to engage with them? And for example, who has set science-based targets or who is on this emission reduction pathway that aligns with our objectives, where again, choosing those different methodologies and choosing those approaches really need to line up with what your overall business objectives and goals are.
Great. And I know that we're getting tight on time and I want to make sure that we leave enough time for questions. But one question I do want to make sure we get to for Modery is how do you see your clients responding to the scope 3 requirements of these laws, given, for example, safe harbor requirements?
I mean, so far, and including us. I mean, we do this work for the firm as well. So I think often in a lot of the conversations we're having with clients right now, because everybody's watching as these regulations come on board. We have, people email us every week, like, can we talk California? Can we talk CSRD? And so the discussion around safe harbor always comes up. It is something that we definitely raise and discuss with our clients, but that doesn't mean it still means even as a firm ourselves, we still have to prepare. I don't think the best thing to do is put our heads in the sand and hope this is going to disappear. I don't think even if there's no SEC rule, a lot of companies are still going to get pulled into CSRD. You're still going to get pulled into California. Washington State is thinking about a similar reg. So it doesn't, I hear a lot of people saying, oh, well, let's see what the SEC does. No, that train passed. So I think even internally, we're getting ready. And I think even with safe harbor provisions, I mean, look, it's this, and I think this is what we've been talking about the whole time is we're going to see what all of this looks like. None of us on this, we don't know what is a perfect report under CSRD? What is a perfect report to the California regulators? I think we're all going to be figuring that out together with our clients. We'll see what it looks like, but definitely, don't not get ready.
Yeah.
Don't depend on the safe harbor provision.
No, for sure. Maduro, I might add some more of that too, like just on the topic of like perfect. You should never let perfect be the enemy of good at the
Yeah,
same time too. That
absolutely.
if you're thinking about starting these calculations going down the path, just get started. So I think that's where a lot of folks are
That's a
thinking right now.
serious step, right? It's
Exactly.
the first one.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, I think that brings us almost to our conclusion. There were a couple key takeaways that we really wanted to anchor on. I think most of this came across in what we've been discussing, but I guess the top 5 list that we want to leave everybody with is number 1, conduct the comprehensive materiality assessment, right? This is only a value to you as a business to better know how to manage and spend your precious resources and time, right? And doing what is most relevant and important to your crucial stakeholders. Number 2, develop a tailored ESG strategy that's anchored on strong governance structures. That is what gives it integrity. That is what makes it defensible, holds your business accountable. That's good. Good governance is good management. Number 3, you have to stay informed on the evolving regulatory requirements. And I would add to that and be aware of where you'll be included in the downstream or kind of trickle down impact, even if you as a company are not directly mandated by that, right? Like we were just saying. Number 4, develop a reasonable approach to reporting and scope 3 emissions. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. You have to get started. It is okay to use estimates. It is okay to use proxies. Just be transparent in when you're doing those things and be clear on communicating what your disclosures represent. And number 5, I think that these are themes that we've really anchored on throughout each of those pillars, but this is about being thoughtful. It is certainly about being transparent. And Maudrey, you actually used the word dynamic before. So I'm going to replace evolve with also be dynamic, right? Because this whole this whole practice is evolving and your business is evolving. And so that's, if the lawyer's telling you to be dynamic, that's, I think that's an indication of that's really where we are in this. Great. Well, I do want to get to a couple questions because I know we have a hard stop at 1. So I've been monitoring the Q&A here. We were getting a lot of questions, not too surprisingly, but around scope 3 emissions, around materiality, around regulations. So I won't be able to get through all of them. We have quite a lot, but starting to get in here, let's see. So we have, I'll start with a nice simple one. For ESRS, it's extensive. ESRS is the reporting standard for CSRD. That's what they mandate you report against. Does it only apply to what is material to the company? And if so, won't every company have different material topics? I like that question. Who wants to take it?
The answer is yes. Companies will have different material topics, but you just need to be prepared to justify why you're omitting something. So, really the documentation of the process and to make it clear to the reader, make it clear to the regulators, to the assurers, you need to show that you've gone through the process and that you can really justify why something is being omitted from your reporting. So there is room for companies to leave stuff off, but at the same time, you need to be prepared to justify that.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the whole process of doing that materiality assessment. That at the start of it, you need to be clear in what we are, our approach, the process that we're going through, and making sure that's most importantly documented, and you're able to then basically say how you got to the topics that were material for you.
Yep. This is another really good one. I like this one. Can you please define value creation? Is this about company profits, or is value creation also defined by the SDGs and improved ecosystems?
I love
That's a
that
good
question.
question.
I love that
Yeah.
question. I'll take a first whack at it. I mean, and it's one of the more fun conversations that we have in the work that we do is, ultimately the work that I think an ESG professional, internal, external, whatever, is doing is we're in the game of value creation. It's figuring out what issues, what topics support long-term value creation for organizations. The next question is then, what is value for your company? Is it simply profits? Is it, financial performance? If so, that's legit. Let's have that conversation and let's focus our efforts around that definition of value. In most cases, there is a more nuanced or more multidimensional definition of value. Financial is always going to be a part of it, honestly. But at the same time, there could be things around, you think about it in the multi-capital model, there's natural capital, natural, environmental value, there's social value, there's relationship stuff, there's really interesting conversations to have with a C-suite, with a board as to, what are those forms of value that you really want to anchor on and center yourself around. And then you can start to think about materiality, you can start to think about strategies and programs and initiatives to create value along those different dimensions and optimize the area under the curve to have the maximum value creation across as many of those dimensions as possible.
Yes, it's bespoke. It's
Totally.
yeah, it's each organization, value creation is going to look different, and exactly what you're saying, Matt. You just have to dive in, um,
Right.
and start thinking about what does it look like for your organization, and what are you comfortable with putting out into the public, and what is internal strategy.
Yeah. Well,
For
a little
sure.
bit continuing on this thread, another question we have was earlier this year, there was some disagreement between Emmanuel Farber at ISSB and the EU over the inclusion of double materiality in the EU standards. So Farber felt that double materiality does not provide financial material metrics for reporting. The question is, do we agree? And how do we use double materiality to provide relevant and financially material metrics for reporting? It's a beefy
No,
one, and we've only got 1 minute. I'm making sure we end on time.
as the double materiality process as it's defined, does include an element of, impact on the business basically. And you can
Yep.
interpret, there's some room to interpret in there as to how quantitative, how strictly financial you need to
Mhm.
there. It is not deeply prescriptive as to the financial impact. It's similar to thinking about TCFD reporting and people talk about the financial impacts of climate change. There's a whole lot of ways to get after that question as well. So there, it's not prescriptive in that sense, but I think the it is implied and it is, intrinsic in the overall process that they want you to be thinking about things that'll impact the business, and that includes financial impact. So how's that for a non-answer?
Yes. What a great place to end, right? We got a lot of questions around scope 3 and emissions and how our tool works. For that, I invite you, please do reach out to us on our contact form or reach out to us at Sustain Life. We are happy to give you more information about how we do everything that we do. I want to thank everybody for dialing in and spending a bit of your afternoon with us, as well as our panelists. Thank you so much for your time and for your insight. We really appreciate it. And we thank you all.